The summer air over Los Angeles shimmered with heat, but inside the gates of Elvis Presley's Bel Air home, everything felt strangely quiet. There were no screaming fans, no television cameras, no reporters hoping for a photograph. Only silence. Elvis stood alone beside the swimming pool, staring at the water as if it held answers that had escaped him years ago. The afternoon sun reflected off the surface, creating ripples that reminded him of applause. Thousands of hands crashing together every night, only to disappear the moment the curtain fell. He sighed. To the world, he had everything: fame, money, beautiful cars, a mansion, movie contracts, millions of records sold. But there were days when all those things felt heavier than chains. Inside the house, a secretary walked toward him carrying a small notepad. "Phone call, Elvis." He barely looked up. "Who is it?" She hesitated. He wouldn't say, but he said you'll recognize the voice. Elvis frowned. Almost nobody called him directly anymore. Conversations usually passed through Colonel Tom Parker, managers, producers, or assistants. Curious, he walked inside and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" For a second there was only breathing. Then came a calm, unmistakable voice. "So, are you still pretending to enjoy those movies?" Elvis laughed, not because the joke was extraordinary, because almost nobody dared speak to him like that. "Marlon." "The one and only. I thought you'd disappeared." "I did," Brando replied. "That's why I called." Elvis leaned against the wall, smiling wider than he had in weeks. There were very few people who never treated him like Elvis Presley. Marlon Brando was one of them. The two men had first crossed paths several years earlier through mutual friends in Hollywood. The newspapers loved comparing them. Both were symbols. Both changed American culture. Both inspired millions. But privately, neither enjoyed being placed on a pedestal. They understood something most people never could. Being admired by millions didn't stop you from feeling lonely. Sometimes, it made loneliness worse. That evening, Brando invited Elvis to his home. "No entourage," Brando said. "No managers. No photographers. Just come." Elvis looked toward the living room. Several business papers lay across the coffee table. Movie schedules, recording contracts, performance offers. Every sheet represented another obligation. Another version of Elvis Presley. Not one represented Elvis himself. "I'll be there." Just after sunset, Elvis slipped behind the wheel of his black Cadillac. For once, he asked only one bodyguard to follow from a distance. No long convoy, no unnecessary attention. Los Angeles glowed beneath the evening sky. Palm trees swayed gently. Restaurants buzzed with celebrities. Neon lights reflected across polished chrome. People recognized Elvis at nearly every traffic light. Some waved, others pointed excitedly. One young couple even abandoned their car to chase his for half a block. He smiled politely, but inside, he wondered whether anyone had ever wanted to meet the man instead of the legend. Brando's house looked surprisingly ordinary. No giant gates, no extravagant decorations, no marble statues announcing wealth. It looked comfortable. When Elvis stepped onto the porch, the front door opened before he even knocked. Marlon Brando stood there wearing faded jeans and a loose blue shirt. No makeup, no Hollywood glamour, only a relaxed grin. He looked Elvis up and down before speaking. "Leave Elvis Presley outside." Elvis blinked. Brando smiled. "Come in as Elvis." For several seconds, Neither man moved. It sounded like such a simple sentence, yet no one had ever spoken those words to him before. Finally, Elvis laughed. "You always know how to make things uncomfortable." Brando laughed louder. "Good." Then he pulled him inside. There were no servants waiting with drinks, no elaborate dinner, no expensive wine. Instead, Brando handed Elvis a cup of coffee. "I hope that's enough." Elvis looked around. Books covered nearly every shelf. History, philosophy, politics, psychology, photography. The house looked less like a movie star's mansion and more like a university professor's home. "You've read all these?" "Most." "You actually finish books?" Brando shrugged. "They don't scream when they see me." Elvis burst into genuine laughter. Not the polite laugh he used during interviews, a real one. It echoed through the room. Brando noticed immediately. "There he is." "Who?" "The guy people forgot existed." Hours passed without anyone mentioning music, or movies, or money. Instead, they spoke about childhood. Elvis described growing up in Tupelo, the tiny house, the poverty, the church music, his mother's kindness. Brando listened without interrupting. Then he shared stories from his own difficult childhood, his complicated relationship with his parents, his struggles before acting, the rejection, the uncertainty. Neither man competed, neither tried to impress the other. For perhaps the first time in months, Elvis wasn't performing. Later that night, Brando disappeared into the kitchen. When he returned, he carried 2 bowls of simple chili. Elvis stared. "That's dinner?" Brando nodded. "What were you expecting?" "I don't know." "Caviar? A chef?" Brando rolled his eyes. "I burned the last thing I tried cooking." Elvis picked up the spoon. "This smells pretty good." "It shouldn't." They laughed again. It felt normal, a word Elvis barely remembered. Around midnight, they stepped into the backyard. The California air had cooled. Crickets chirped softly. The city lights shimmered in the distance. Brando sat on an old wooden bench. Elvis joined him. For several minutes, neither man said anything. No conversation, no pressure, just silence. Oddly, it was the most peaceful silence Elvis had experienced in years. Finally, Brando spoke. "You know what everyone gets wrong about fame?" Elvis looked over. "They think it gives you freedom." He shook his head. "It doesn't. It gives everyone else permission to tell you who you're supposed to be." Elvis stared into the darkness. Every interview, every producer, every manager, every headline, every expectation, every demand, every smiling photograph, every carefully rehearsed public appearance. He suddenly realized Brando had described his entire life in one sentence. Before leaving, Elvis paused near the front door. "You know," Brando raised an eyebrow, "I didn't sing once tonight." "I noticed." "You didn't ask." "I wasn't interested." Elvis smiled. "You weren't?" "I already know Elvis Presley can sing." Brando looked directly into his eyes. "I wanted to know whether Elvis could smile." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Elvis quietly answered, "I think I remembered how." Driving home after 1 in the morning, Los Angeles looked different. Nothing had changed. The streets were the same. The lights were the same. The city was the same. Only Elvis had changed. Just a little. As he stopped at a red light, 2 teenagers recognized him. They rolled down their window and shouted excitedly, "We love you, Elvis!" He smiled warmly. "Thank you." Usually those words felt like part of the job. Tonight, they felt different. because for the first time in a long while, someone had reminded him that beneath the gold records, beneath the magazine covers, beneath the carefully crafted image, there was still a man. And perhaps that man wasn't lost after all. What Elvis didn't realize was that this quiet evening at Marlon Brando's house would become the beginning of one of the most meaningful friendships of his life. A friendship that would soon be tested by impossible choices, growing pressure from Hollywood, and a conversation that would change the course of Elvis's future forever. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Elvis had almost forgotten was possible. Every Tuesday evening, if neither of them was working, Elvis would quietly drive across Los Angeles without announcing his destination to anyone except a single trusted bodyguard. The newspapers had no idea. His fans certainly didn't. Even Colonel Tom Parker assumed Elvis was attending business meetings or private dinners with studio executives. In reality, the biggest star in rock and roll spent those evenings drinking coffee with one of Hollywood's greatest actors, talking about everything except fame. For Elvis, those nights became something sacred, a place where no one expected perfection, a place where mistakes were welcome, a place where silence wasn't awkward. It was healing. One Tuesday, Brando greeted him with an old flannel shirt, worn jeans, and a baseball cap. "We're going out." Elvis looked around. "Where?" "You'll see. I should probably call security." Brando shook his head. "No." "You serious?" "Very." Elvis hesitated. "People recognize me everywhere." Brando smiled. "Then we'll give them someone else to recognize." He tossed another baseball cap toward Elvis. "And put that on." 30 minutes later, they were sitting inside a tiny roadside diner tucked away on the outskirts of Los Angeles. It wasn't fashionable. Movie stars didn't eat there. The coffee wasn't very good. The booths were cracked. The waitress looked exhausted after working a double shift. Exactly the kind of place Elvis loved before he became famous. He pulled the cap lower over his forehead. "You really think this will work?" Brando shrugged. "It only has to work long enough for us to order pie." Elvis laughed. "You planned this around pie?" "I always plan around pie." The waitress approached with a tired smile. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" Brando answered first. "2 coffees and 2 slices of apple pie." She scribbled the order without looking twice. No screams, no gasps, no excitement. Just another pair of customers. Elvis watched her walk away. His expression slowly changed. "What?" Brando smiled. "You're disappointed." "I am not." "You are." Elvis looked down. "I forgot what it feels like." "What?" "To be invisible." For several minutes, Elvis simply watched the restaurant. A truck driver laughed loudly in the corner. An elderly couple quietly shared a milkshake. 2 construction workers argued about baseball. Nobody cared who sat in booth 7. Nobody expected an autograph. Nobody wanted a photograph. For the first time in years, Elvis was part of the room instead of being the room. He almost didn't want to leave. As they finished dessert, a little boy wandered past their booth carrying a toy airplane. He looked at Elvis for a second. Elvis froze. The boy tilted his head, then smiled politely. "Excuse me," and kept walking. Elvis watched him disappear. Brando noticed. "You thought he recognized you." "I did. He didn't." Elvis slowly smiled. "I know." His eyes drifted toward the window. "I can't believe how much I missed that." Driving back through Los Angeles, Elvis became unusually quiet. Brando finally asked, "What are you thinking?" Elvis stared out the window. I don't know if I became famous because I loved music. He paused. Or if somewhere along the way I forgot why I loved it. The words surprised even him. He had never admitted that out loud, not to anyone. Brando didn't rush to answer. Instead, he let the silence breathe. Finally, he said, "You know what happens when an actor believes the audience more than himself?" "What?" "He forgets who he's playing." The sentence lingered in Elvis's mind long after the evening ended. The next morning, reality returned. Studio executives filled the conference room. Movie posters lined the walls. Stacks of scripts sat waiting. One producer enthusiastically described another musical comedy. More songs, more dancing, more predictable romance, more colorful costumes. The room buzzed with excitement. Everyone expected Elvis to smile. Instead, he quietly flipped through the pages. Each scene felt strangely familiar. Different title, same movie, different actress, same ending. He closed the script. "I've already made this picture." The room fell silent. One executive forced a laugh. "No, Elvis, this one's completely different." Elvis looked him straight in the eyes. "Then why does it feel exactly the same?" No one answered. Later that afternoon, Colonel Parker entered Elvis's office carrying a cigar and his usual confident grin. "I hear you're getting picky." Elvis didn't look up. "I'm getting tired. Tired people make bad business decisions. I'm talking about the movies. They're making money. They're making money for everybody." The colonel smiled. "Exactly." Elvis slowly stood. "But they're not making me happy." For a brief second, the room became very still. Parker's expression hardened. "Happiness doesn't pay salaries." Elvis stared back. "No. It just lets you sleep at night." That evening, Elvis drove directly to Brando's house. He didn't even call first. Brando opened the door. One look at Elvis's face was enough. "Tough day?" Elvis nodded. "They want another movie." "You don't." "I don't even want to read the script." Brando motioned toward the living room. "Tell me." For nearly an hour, Elvis spoke without interruption. About contracts, schedules, expectations, the endless pressure to smile for cameras, the fear of disappointing fans, the fear of disappointing himself even more. When he finally stopped talking, he leaned back, exhausted. "I sound ungrateful." Brando shook his head. "No, you sound trapped." Brando walked toward one of the bookshelves. He removed an old photography book and handed it to Elvis. Inside were dozens of black and white portraits. Not glamorous publicity photos, real people. Wrinkles, imperfections, honest faces. Brando pointed to one picture of an elderly fisherman. "What do you see?" Elvis shrugged. "A fisherman. I see a man who never had to pretend." Elvis studied the image longer. Brando continued, "The world keeps asking you to become more like Elvis Presley." He leaned forward. "I'm wondering when Elvis gets a chance to become more like himself." Those words echoed inside Elvis for days. During rehearsals, during interviews, during photo shoots, even while signing stacks of fan mail. He began noticing how often he answered questions the public wanted to hear instead of what he actually believed. It frightened him, because he wasn't sure anymore where the performance ended and where he began. One Friday evening, Elvis invited Brando to Graceland. Unlike Hollywood parties, it wasn't crowded. Only a few close friends were present. The piano sat quietly in the corner. Someone suggested Elvis should sing. The room immediately became excited. "Come on, Elvis! Just one song." Elvis smiled politely. Before he could answer, Brando spoke. "Leave him alone." The room went quiet. Brando wasn't angry. His voice was calm. "He doesn't owe anybody a performance tonight." Several guests looked uncomfortable. One laughed nervously. "We're only asking." Brando nodded. "I know. That's the problem." Later, after most guests had gone home, Elvis found Brando sitting alone on the front porch. The Mississippi night was warm. Fireflies floated across the lawn. Elvis quietly sat beside him. "You know," Brando smiled, "I probably ruined your party." "No." Elvis looked toward the dark driveway. "You may have saved my evening." He paused before continuing. "Nobody's ever defended me from being Elvis." Brando looked at him carefully. "They shouldn't have to. But sometimes," Elvis swallowed hard, "I forget how." Neither man noticed the distant figure standing inside the house. Colonel Parker had arrived unexpectedly. He had seen enough of the conversation to realize something that unsettled him deeply. For years, he had shaped Elvis's career with almost complete control. Now someone else had begun influencing the king. And Colonel Parker had no intention of letting that continue. As Elvis and Brando sat beneath the quiet southern sky, neither of them realized that their friendship had just gained a powerful enemy, one who believed that a happy Elvis was far less profitable than a busy one. The autumn of 1968 arrived with a strange mixture of excitement and fear. Everywhere Elvis went, people spoke about one thing: his comeback. The NBC television special was only weeks away, and everyone believed it had to succeed. It wasn't simply another performance. It was a second chance. For years, Elvis had been buried beneath predictable Hollywood musicals, colorful costumes, and safe performances that pleased studio executives, but left his own heart empty. Now, for the first time in a long while, he had an opportunity to remind the world who he truly was. But privately, he wasn't sure he remembered himself. Rehearsals filled every day. Musicians tuned guitars. Lighting crews adjusted spotlights. Television producers argued over camera angles. Wardrobe designers carried racks of clothing through the studio. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone wanted to shape the new Elvis Presley. Everyone, except Marlon Brando. One evening after rehearsal, Elvis arrived at Brando's house looking exhausted. He dropped onto the couch without saying a word. Brando waited. 5 minutes passed. Neither man spoke. Finally, Elvis whispered, "I'm scared." Brando looked at him calmly. "Good." Elvis frowned. "Good? If you weren't scared," Brando smiled gently, "it would mean you didn't care anymore." Elvis rubbed his face with both hands. "They expect me to prove I'm still the king." Brando leaned back. "No. They expect Elvis Presley." He paused. "The question is," he looked directly into Elvis's eyes, "who are you expecting?" The room became silent again. Elvis couldn't answer, because he genuinely didn't know. A few days later, rehearsals took an unexpected turn. The television producers unveiled elaborate Christmas-themed costumes, bright decorations, perfect choreography, artificial smiles. One producer excitedly described the opening sequence. "It'll be cheerful, colorful, exactly what America wants." Elvis quietly stared at the sketches. His expression didn't change. Inside, everything did. After the meeting, he walked outside alone. The California sun was setting, but he barely noticed. One thought kept repeating inside his head: "This isn't me." That evening, he drove straight to Brando. Without knocking, he entered through the back gate as he had done many times before. Brando was sitting beneath a tree, reading a novel. He closed the book as soon as he saw Elvis. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one that says somebody else is trying to live your life." Elvis sat beside him. "They've turned my comeback into another movie." Brando didn't seem surprised. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." "That's not true." Elvis looked down. "You already know." For several minutes, neither of them moved. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed. It reminded Elvis of simpler days. Days before contracts. Before headlines. Before becoming an icon. Brando finally spoke. "Tell me something." "What?" "When you were 17, Elvis looked up. "What did you want?" Elvis smiled faintly. "I wanted people to feel something." "And now?" "They want me to entertain them." Brando nodded. "Those aren't always the same thing." The words followed Elvis all week. During rehearsals, he found himself paying less attention to choreography and more attention to the musicians. One afternoon, during a break, he quietly picked up an acoustic guitar. There was no audience, no cameras, no director, only a handful of musicians sitting nearby. He began playing softly. No rehearsed movements, no polished performance, just music. The room gradually became silent. One by one, crew members stopped working. They gathered around without saying a word. Someone smiled. Another quietly wiped away tears. When Elvis finished, nobody applauded immediately. The silence spoke louder than applause ever could. Finally, an old guitarist whispered, "That's the Elvis we missed." Later that evening, director Steve Binder approached him. "I've never seen you play like that." Elvis shrugged. "I wasn't trying." Binder smiled. "Exactly." Those two words struck Elvis harder than anyone realized. Maybe. Trying had been the problem all along. Trying to satisfy everyone. Trying to protect an image. Trying to become a legend every single day. He had forgotten that legends were born from honesty, not calculation. Colonel Parker, however, saw things differently. When he heard rumors that Elvis wanted changes to the television special, he immediately arranged a meeting. His office felt unusually tense. Contracts covered the desk, ratings projections, advertising agreements. Everything depended on a successful show. Parker lit another cigar. "I hear you're improvising." "I'm making the show better." "The show is already planned." "It doesn't feel real." Parker leaned forward. "Reality isn't what people buy." Elvis remained calm. "I think it is." The colonel's smile disappeared. "You've been spending too much time with Brando." The room instantly fell silent. Elvis slowly raised his eyes. "What does that have to do with anything? He fills your head with ideas." "No," Elvis answered firmly. "He reminds me to think for myself." For the first time in years, Colonel Parker realized he was losing his influence, not because Elvis had become rebellious, because he had become confident. Several days later, Brando invited Elvis on another late-night drive. No destination, no schedule. They cruised along the Pacific Coast Highway while the ocean reflected the moonlight. The windows were down. The cool air carried the scent of salt water. Neither man rushed to speak. Eventually, Brando pulled onto a quiet overlook above the beach. They climbed out of the car. Far below, waves crashed endlessly against the shore. Brando stared into the darkness. "Do you hear that?" "The ocean?" "No." Elvis listened again. "Only waves." "What am I supposed to hear?" Brando smiled. Nobody's telling the ocean how to sound. Elvis laughed softly. That's one of the strangest things you've ever said. Maybe. Brando looked toward him. But it's true. He pointed toward the water. It doesn't ask permission to be itself. Elvis stood there for a long moment. Then he quietly admitted, I've been asking permission my whole career. The confession surprised even him. Brando didn't react immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on Elvis's shoulder. You've already earned the right to be yourself. He smiled warmly. You don't need anyone else's approval. The words stayed with Elvis during the final rehearsals. Then came the unexpected crisis. Only days before filming, producers insisted the program end with a polished Christmas number. Elvis didn't object to the song itself. He objected to what it represented. Another safe ending. Another carefully manufactured image. Another version of Elvis, created for someone else's comfort. Late that night, he called Brando. I don't know if I should fight this. Brando answered without hesitation. If you don't, he paused, you'll spend the next 10 years wishing you had. The next morning, Elvis walked into the studio with a quiet confidence no one had seen before. He requested a private meeting with Steve Binder. For nearly 2 hours they talked behind closed doors. When the meeting ended, Binder emerged smiling. Plans had changed. The television special would include something raw, something honest, something alive. Elvis would sit in a circle with his musicians, dressed in black leather, performing with the freedom that had been missing for years. When Colonel Parker learned about the decision, he was furious. He argued, he threatened, he warned everyone that America wouldn't accept it. But this time, Elvis didn't back down. Because somewhere between quiet conversations, roadside diners, and nights spent talking beneath California skies, he had stopped asking who the world wanted him to be, and started remembering the young man from Tupelo who simply loved to sing. Neither Elvis nor Brando could have imagined that the performance waiting just days ahead would become one of the greatest moments in music history, and that before the lights came on, the two friends would share one final conversation that neither of them would ever forget. The studio lights had not yet been switched on. Rows of empty seats stretched into the darkness. Camera operators moved quietly between enormous television cameras. Electricians adjusted cables. Musicians tuned their instruments one final time. The room buzzed with nervous anticipation. But in a small dressing room behind the stage, Elvis Presley sat alone. His black leather suit rested on a hanger beside him. His guitar leaned against the wall. On the table sat a cup of untouched coffee. His hands were clasped together. Not because he was cold, because they were shaking. Millions of people expected a miracle. Hollywood expected redemption. His record company expected profits. Colonel Parker expected another victory. Everyone expected something from Elvis Presley. Everyone. Except one man. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Before Elvis answered, the door slowly opened. Marlon Brando stepped inside. No reporters had seen him arrive. No photographers waited outside. He had come for only one reason: his friend. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Brando looked around the dressing room. Movie posters, telegrams wishing Elvis good luck, bouquets of flowers, stacks of fan mail, awards, gold records, evidence of an extraordinary career. Yet sitting in the middle of all that success was a man who looked terrified. Brando smiled. You look like you're about to face a firing squad." Elvis laughed nervously. "It feels worse." Brando sat beside him. "Still scared?" Elvis nodded. "More than ever." Brando leaned forward. "Good." Elvis rolled his eyes. "You keep saying that, and I'll keep saying it." He paused. "The day you stop being nervous is the day you stop caring." Elvis looked down at his hands. "What if I disappoint them?" Brando quietly asked. "Who?" "The audience." Brando shook his head. "I'm not talking about them." He pointed gently toward Elvis's chest. "What if you disappoint him?" The question landed like thunder. For years, Elvis had worried about critics, managers, television executives, newspapers, fans. He had almost forgotten to ask himself whether he was proud of the man in the mirror. Several minutes passed in complete silence. Finally, Elvis whispered, "I don't know if they'll accept the real me anymore." Brando smiled. "You've got it backward." Elvis looked confused. "They've been waiting years to meet the real you." Outside the dressing room, someone knocked. "5 minutes, Mr. Presley." The moment had arrived. Elvis slowly stood. He picked up the black leather jacket. Brando stopped him. "One more thing." Elvis turned. "When those lights come on," he smiled warmly, "leave Elvis Presley backstage." Elvis stared at him. The words sounded familiar, almost exactly like the first night they had met. Brando continued, "Walk out there as the kid from Tupelo." For a brief second, neither man moved. Then Elvis embraced him. Not as two celebrities, not as two legends, simply as two friends. Moments later, the lights exploded across the studio. The audience erupted. People screamed. Camera operators counted down. 3, 2, 1. The music began. Elvis walked into the spotlight. Something felt different. There was confidence, but there was also freedom. He smiled, not because someone had instructed him to, because he genuinely wanted to. As the performance unfolded, every song carried a new energy. There were mistakes, unexpected laughs, improvised moments, natural conversations with the musicians. Nothing felt rehearsed. Everything felt alive. When Elvis sat surrounded by his band during the intimate jam session, television history quietly changed. There were no elaborate dance numbers, no forced acting, only music, real music. Crew members behind the cameras exchanged astonished glances. Several had worked with Elvis for years. None had ever seen him look so relaxed. One lighting technician quietly whispered, "He's finally home." Watching from behind the cameras, Brando smiled to himself. He wasn't smiling because the audience loved it. He wasn't smiling because the critics would praise it. He smiled because he recognized something no one else could see. For the first time in years, Elvis wasn't carrying the weight of being Elvis Presley. He was simply sharing songs he loved, and that made all the difference. The television special became an extraordinary success. Viewers across America couldn't stop talking about it. Newspapers called it one of the greatest comebacks in entertainment history. Music critics praised Elvis's honesty. Fans said they felt as if they had rediscovered the artist they had fallen in love with years before. The world celebrated the comeback. Few people understood the journey behind it. Life quickly became busy again. Recording sessions returned. Concert plans filled the calendar. Las Vegas called. The world wanted more Elvis. Yet something fundamental had changed. Whenever pressure became overwhelming, whenever contracts piled up, whenever the expectations of fame threatened to consume him again. Elvis would quietly disappear for an evening. Sometimes he drove to Brando's home. Sometimes they talked until sunrise. Sometimes they said almost nothing at all. They didn't need constant conversation. Real friendship rarely does. One evening in early 1969, after Elvis had completed another exhausting week of rehearsals, he visited Brando once more. They sat outside watching the sunset paint the California sky in shades of gold and crimson. Neither held a script. Neither carried a guitar. Neither spoke about careers. Brando finally broke the silence. "Do you know why our friendship works?" Elvis smiled. "Because you're strange?" Brando laughed. "That's part of it." Then his expression softened. "We've both spent our lives being watched." He looked toward the horizon. "But we don't watch each other." Elvis nodded slowly. He understood. Most people observed him to judge him, to admire him, to criticize him, to ask something from him. Brando simply saw him. Years continued to pass. Their paths often crossed despite demanding schedules. Phone calls became frequent. Sometimes they lasted only 5 minutes, sometimes more than an hour. They spoke about books, children, travel, politics, faith, life. Rarely about fame, because neither of them needed to explain what fame felt like. The other already knew. History would remember Elvis Presley as the king of rock and roll. History would remember Marlon Brando as one of cinema's greatest actors. Books would celebrate their achievements. Films would honor their careers. Millions would study their performances. But very few would ever understand the quiet gift they gave one another. Not advice, not business opportunities, not publicity. Something far more valuable. Permission. Permission to remove the mask. Permission to admit fear. Permission to laugh without performing. Permission to fail. Permission to be ordinary. Many years later, people would ask countless questions about Elvis Presley. How did he become a legend? How did he command audiences so effortlessly? What inspired his remarkable comeback? There would be many answers. His talent, his determination, his love of music. All of those answers would be true. But hidden behind the headlines was another truth. Sometimes, the strongest people don't need someone to make them greater. Sometimes, they simply need someone who reminds them who they were before the world gave them a crown. Because every king eventually grows tired of wearing it, and every once in a while, even the king of rock and roll needed a place where he could set the crown aside, sit with a trusted friend, drink an ordinary cup of coffee, and simply be Elvis. That was the gift Marlon Brando gave him. Not fame, not success, not advice. Just the rarest gift one human being can offer another. The freedom to feel completely, wonderfully normal.